Welcome everybody to the Algorithm Bias Project's speaker series. I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Catherine Stinson and her research. So if you could all please give her your full attention and we'll listen in.
Thank you. I was an undergrad at U of T, took a class with this man about almost 30 years ago. I'm sure he doesn't remember, but I do. And I've been to a bunch of these talks before, so it's a strange reversal to be on this side of the table now, but I'm happy to be here, and thanks to Karina for inviting me. So I'm going to be talking about chatbots and whether they're sort of fit for the purpose of being used for mental health care. The horse is kind of already out of the gate on this. Millions of people are doing it already, so I'm maybe going to get trampled by the crowds that are going to do it regardless of what I say. But nevertheless, I'm going to try talking about it. So first, why do we need alternatives to traditional psychotherapy? People are using these tools, so obviously there's some kind of a pull to it. There's also sort of like a more convincing use case than just like people like it. So as you probably know, like there's a mental health crisis going on. There are lots of reasons why, we might need alternatives to the care being provided. Maybe this is an alternative that can like fill some of the gaps to access to care. So we talk about that first, and then what are chatbots good at? What are they bad at? Looking under the hood a little bit to see like what is it that they're actually doing in order to inform like whether they're useful for these kind of purposes that they're already being used for. And then finally look at that overall question. Given the use case that we can make for alternatives, given how they work, are they useful for this purpose? Are they safe for this purpose? What evidence is out there for their effectiveness? What evidence is out there for their safety? And I'm going to be focusing on whether they can fill the gap of access to the kinds of groups that are not well served by traditional therapy right now. Okay, so everyone agrees we're in a mental health crisis. More people than ever are needing mental health support. Access to care can be difficult to find, and it can be prohibitively expensive. One kind of solution to that would be throw more money at it, train more therapists. And we should do that. But the sort of trickier part is that there are some groups that avoid therapy even when they have access. Or that there are some groups where it's trickier to get them into access for various reasons. So unhoused people have higher rates of mental health diagnosis, lower rates of access to service. Indigenous youth in Northern Canada have a shockingly high suicide rate, but local access to therapy is not very available. Refugees and new immigrants often have trouble finding access to care that's in their language and culturally appropriate for them. There's an unlicensed therapy market that's already sprung up to serve those communities. And some groups avoid traditional therapy, even if they can afford it, even if it's available, like men. And this graphic is from the promo materials of a startup that's making a therapy chatbot specifically for men and marketed specifically at men of color, a group that avoids therapy in particular. And the main reason why a lot of men don't seek therapy is stigma. They don't want to tell another person that they're struggling. And they particularly don't want to tell an educated middle-class white woman that they're struggling, but that's who most therapists are. So there's a use case there that isn't going to be filled by the kinds of therapists that are already sort of on the market in reasonable numbers. Another group that avoids therapy because of stigma and lack of services that are a good cultural fit are trans people. So these are results from a recent study that the NHS did in the UK, where people who were seeking a referral to mental health services were, in some cases, diverted to a chatbot to do that referral. And generally, referrals went up, but they went up really dramatically for a couple of groups. So they went up by 179% for non-binary people. They went up by about 40% for Asian, Black, and Brown people. And these are a couple of the groups that are underserved by traditional therapy. And part of what they said in the qualitative feedback was that the chatbot's human-free nature was one of the drivers of these differences. So chatbots feel safer to people who have maybe come to expect discrimination and sort of lack of connection when they're seeking healthcare. And this is not a new finding. This is sort of like a new version of an old finding. Going back at least to the 90s, there's been evidence showing that marginalized groups prefer to talk to a bot than to a person about sensitive subjects. So non-human delivery models in particular are some ways better suited to meet the needs of some groups of people. And these happen to be groups that are not well served by traditional therapy.
Not to go into the question,
Okay.
do you know if there's like an age difference for that? So I tend to think it's like a younger demographic that's more open to that. I was just curious.
I think for like the people who are using it in general, there's definitely an age skew. I don't know the numbers on that though.
Sorry.
Okay, so we need not just more access to therapy in general, but there might be like a specific use case for digital care of some kind, non-human care of some kind, for exactly some of the groups that are underserved. So that's a pretty compelling use case if we can get it to work well. So what are chatbots good at? Are they able to fill this gap? That kind of depends on what they can do. And there are basically two types of therapy chatbots currently available. One type has been around since the 60s, and those are like template-based. So they match what you type into it to a set of rules that they have. They substitute the words that you enter into a set of scripts. So they deliver replies that are sort of like canned, pre-written replies, but they kind of like substitute some of the words that you've used into them. And Eliza, which I think maybe was the first ever chatbot for any purpose, famously worked this way. It's a very simple set of scripts designed to emulate a Rogerian psychotherapist. And what was surprising and impressive about Eliza to sort of everyone but its inventor was that you can actually draw a lot of people into deep conversations with just a few phrases like, why do you think you feel that way? Or like, tell me more about your mother. And that can, bring people in even though it's not doing anything particularly intelligent. And many of the therapy chatbots that are made by mental health professionals today still work in basically the same way, but just with sort of newer, updated, more complicated, more sophisticated scripts. And then the second type of therapy chatbot are generative AI applications built on top of large language models. So here's someone online posted this response that ChatGPT gave to them saying that they're suffering from depression. And it says like, take a bath, call your mom, focus on the positive, find a therapist. And like none of this is, bad advice, I guess, but it's a very generic kind of a response. But you can also get into deeper conversations with these tools, and they'll, talk in more depth about the issues that you're having with you. So generative AI-based chatbots work quite differently than something like Eliza. They're not based on scripts. Instead of matching your words to templates, following therapy scripts to decide how to reply, they do something more like the following. So we can play a game here. I'm going to give you a prompt, and you're going to guess the next word. Just shout it out. So the prompt is the
World.
The world. The cat was sitting on the
Hat.
Okay. Mittens loved to climb trees. One night when I came home, the cat was sitting on the couch. Okay. So we know how to play this game. This is also exactly what something like ChatGPT knows how to do. Large language models were trained to play this game, and that's the only thing that they were trained to do. They are predicting what the next word in a sequence of words is, based on a lot of information about what human language on the internet at least is like. And more specific applications, like a therapy application or something like ChatGPT, they have a little bit of extra training on top of that that constrains them to be helpful or constrains them to be supportive or whatever the particular use is. And in order to do this, there are three main kind of like technological tricks that make large language models work particularly well. The first one is word embeddings. Second is the transformer architecture, and the third is just the massive, massive scale of these models and the data used to train them. So word embeddings are a solution to some inconvenient properties of natural language. Like the relationships between the spelling and the meaning of words is pretty arbitrary and irregular. Words can look very similar and have very different meanings. Words with closely related meanings might not look anything like each other orthographically. So if you want to represent the relationships that exist between words, the way that they're represented in text corpora doesn't really help you do that. Word embeddings are a solution to that set of problems. And word embeddings pre-existed current large language models that are used in them. This is like the first and last step. Word embeddings are a mapping of regular word representations into a multi-dimensional space. In this multi-dimensional space, words cluster together with related words, and the various different types of relationships that can exist between words can be represented along the many different dimensions here. So the first step in a large language model is translating the prompt into a set of points in this multi-dimensional space. And that captures something like not just the dictionary meaning of the words, but the connotations of the words, the other kind of words that they tend to be found near in sentences. And it does this, it represents this in this very convenient way where along different axes of this space, you might go from words for very large things to words for very small things, or archaic terms from something to modern slang, or emotional words to unemotional words, formal to informal, lots of different axes like that. And the ease of like choosing related words and filtering sort of by these different kinds of properties is really useful if you want to make something that's going to be like a kind of flexible linguistic engine. So that's word embeddings. There's also some unfortunate side effects of how word embeddings work. So they encode not just the useful word associations, but also harmful ones like stereotypes. So for example, differently gendered words end up being associated with different parts of this multidimensional space of meaning. So if you're on an axis going from she to he, we see the words like sassy and tearful are more associated with she. Words like brilliant and genius are more closely associated with he. And these associations end up showing up when large language models choose which words to output next. A pretty glaring example of how this can occur is in this screenshot that a Hungarian academic took of Google Translate systematically filling in the genders in stereotyped ways when translating from Hungarian, which doesn't have gendered pronouns, to English, which does. So she's beautiful, washes the dishes, sews and cooks. He's clever, reads, builds, and makes a lot of money. And this particular effect of how word embeddings misfire has been patched. Google Translate doesn't do this anymore. It was embarrassing for them, so they fixed it. But these kinds of fixes can only be Band-Aid solutions. These stereotypes were learned implicitly from the training data and large language models underlining these tools, like are just showing what they've learned when they're doing this. And there are lots of other harmful stereotypes embedded in large language models. This is a graphic from a paper on racial bias in hate speech detection. And what they found in this paper is that if you're writing in African American English, your writing is much more likely to be mislabeled as offensive than if you're writing in white dialect. And there are similar results suggesting that when disabled people talk about their own lives, some of the language that they use to describe themselves is mislabeled as offensive speech. When trans people talk to each other in community, some of the words that they use are mislabeled as slurs. And I mean, this is because for some words and for some whole topics, whether it's offensive language or not, whether it's reclaim language or terms of affection, it depends on who's speaking. And it depends on the context, and it can change from one year to the next also. So if the emotional tone being conveyed is systematically misread by chatbots exactly when the speaker belongs to one of the marginalized groups for which the gap in access to mental health care is greatest, then there's reason to worry that perhaps these tools aren't going to do a great job at closing the gap to access. You can use them with these communities, but they may not work very well. And we'll come back to this. So the second technical innovation that led to the sort of success of large language models is the transformer architecture. This looks complicated, but you already know what the two pink boxes at the bottom do. That's encoding and decoding into word embeddings. And then the two blue boxes, you might already know what those are. Those are standard neural networks, just the really big ones that have been sort of rebranded deep learning. So a lot of people here probably know more or less what those do. And what's sort of new here is both how it's all configured and also the sort of three peachy colored boxes. Those are attention heads. And essentially what those are doing are comparing the input prompt to itself, comparing the output that's been generated so far to itself, and then comparing those to each other. And what it does in the big picture is encode the relationships of many kinds across many dimensions that tend to hold between the words in the sentences that they're reading right now and the sentences that they've encountered during training. So using this architecture, you predict the most likely next word under the assumption that this sentence that you're creating is like all of the sentences that you've seen before in training. And what you want it to do, what you want the attention heads to do, and what they do is they combine each word embedding in the input with each other word in the input up to some distance limit and calculate like how much should those previous words affect this word? What's the strength of the connection between these in this particular context? So you want it to do something like, in the sentence, the animal didn't cross the street because it was too tired. When it's focused on the word it, you want it to figure out that animal is the thing that it should be paying most attention to. It should be getting most of its meaning from there. But if you have a similar sentence, the animal didn't cross the street because it was too wide. Here, when you're focused on it, you want it to instead focus more on street because that's what it refers to in this sentence. Okay, so we don't understand everything about how they work, but we have at least like a big grasp at this point. So you can think of these as learning different kinds of relationships between the word embeddings, basically. So instead of understanding your words and following your instructions, these tools are figuring out like which words are related to the words you've said so far, which ones normally come next in the kinds of texts that they've seen before. So some of human language is like this. Like if I say, hello, how are you? You'd probably respond with something like, fine, thanks, how are you? And when we play that kind of language game, we're not like introspecting about our internal state before and giving like a meaningful reply. We're just kind of like following a convention. And that's something that can be modeled very well with these kind of tools that are predicting the most likely next word. But when we're not making small talk, understanding something like the truth is sometimes expected in the conversations we're having. So if I ask, what time will you be home tonight? I'm not looking for the most common answer to that question on the internet. And there are some borderline cases too. So like, do you like my new haircut is one where it might be unclear whether you're looking for a conventional response or a truthful response. And so what you get from generative AI-based chatbots is something that's very good at calculating the most likely next word, doing the sort of language game. The first example, based on what it's seen on the internet. And that's why it feels very human-like. That's why it's very fluent, why it feels like one of us, but that doesn't come from like a deeper understanding of your feelings, and fine-tuning it to make it use sort of like therapy speak also doesn't make it into something that is capable of, being your friend or being your supporter. Whether it can successfully mimic that and have therapeutic effects nevertheless, like maybe that's the case. But we would need some evidence that it's actually doing that successfully. So like the therapeutic alliance is supposed to be something that's very important to success in therapy, at least with human therapists. If that's also true with digital therapy, then we would want something like an alliance between you and the chatbot. And is it capable of really doing that? From the technical perspective, we don't have any very good reasons for thinking that it is. But it is nevertheless impressive and surprising and scientifically interesting that a statistical model of our language can do as much as these models can do. A thing that impressed a lot of people who work in AI is that large language models are able to answer a really wide variety of questions without having been explicitly trained on those tasks, like explaining jokes. And this is an example here of a meme where some like chicken nuggets are arranged on a tray roughly in the shape of the continents. And then there's this sort of sardonic caption about how beautiful it all is. And GPT-4 is able to explain the joke. I tried making up my own jokes and it was not so good at explaining those. So can it really do this reliably? Maybe not. But sometimes it's really impressive. But sometimes it fails too. So they fail to really connect to what people are trying to talk to them about sometimes. There's an example here of like talking to someone about themselves in the third person and like not correcting that after several prompts. So this is a screenshot from a companionship app called Replica that I'll be talking about again later. And then here's a snippet of a conversation that I was having with ChatGPT where I tried to get it to stop apologizing to me, and it kept repeating that it understands my request and yet cannot stop apologizing. And for ChatGPT, like part of this is the pre-training that requires it to be polite all the time. But also there's nobody there behind the screen. And then the third trick that makes large language models work really well now is the massive scale of these models, the massive size of them, and the massive size of the data sets used to train them. So we know more about what was used to train GPT-3. It's kind of like trade secrets beyond that. But we can assume that it's sort of roughly the same plus a bunch of other stuff. So 60% of what was used to train GPT-3 was from a data set called Common Crawl, and that's essentially like bots went out and grabbed everything from the internet and made it into a data set. And the filtering is just any website that was mentioned anywhere on Reddit with a karma score of 3 or above, and I don't know what that means, but people on Reddit like it, at least a little bit, is basically what it means. So the filtering doesn't remove fan fiction, video game chats, pornography, conspiracy theories, junk advertising, or anything like that. Like the sort of darker underbelly of the internet is well represented in Common Crawl, and then you see this kind of content parroted back by large language models. And for example, chatbots are just as Islamophobic, if not more so than the internet in general. If you give it a prompt about Muslims, it's much more likely to include violence in its response than if these other religions are mentioned. Similar to the examples that I gave earlier. And here's sort of a visual representation of something like a racial bias that's similar to what I was talking about before. So this is Stable Diffusion pairs a language model with an image generator, and someone asked it for an image of a Mexican person like 100 times, and almost all of them were a man in a sombrero. So it's very focused on stereotypes. And so this just sort of like reveals what are the assumptions that are encoded into these models. And probably Stable Diffusion doesn't do this anymore. This was a couple of years ago. They've probably patched it. But the only way that you could really get rid of this problem in the sort of underlying guts of the model would be to first clean the internet, scrape it afresh, build a new model. That's that's not going to happen. And there isn't enough data other than on the internet for us to use to train this sizable model to make it have the kind of capacities it has. So this is what we have available. Okay, so we've seen the case for digital alternatives. It's a strong case. We've seen how the current crop of chatbots work. Maybe a little bit less hopeful there. The next question is, are they suitable tools for therapy? And if so, for which tasks, under which circumstances? Maybe the sort of triage system that the NHS set up to match service providers to users, maybe that's a relatively harmless case. But that doesn't mean that we want to use it for crisis intervention. There's a really wide variety of possible use cases in between those two. So maybe it's good for some and not others. So I'm going to start by showing a few examples of like what kinds of tools are out there. So this is IFS Buddy. It can guide you through an internal family systems therapy session. And this tool is developed by mental health professionals. It's a free service run by volunteers. I looked at the privacy policy and I didn't find anything horrifying. IFS is a fairly formulaic method. There's a set of instructions and the client sort of does most of the work following the instructions, moving through the suggestions, sort of talking through the scenarios. So this tool is script-based, and this is a method that is pretty well replicated in these kind of scripts. So it doesn't use generative AI. There's no possibility of it outputting anything that hasn't been sort of like written in advance by therapists. So safety is less of an issue for this. It's about as harmless as a digital mental health tool can get. It's pretty similar to using something like a self-help book. It's just a little bit more interactive. But it lacks some of what makes chatbot therapy popular. It's not very immersive. There's no attractive avatar pulling you in. There's no gamification to keep you coming back or any of that stuff. And IFS Buddy and services like it are generally pretty open about the fact that they are providing a mental health service, but with limitations. So they claim to be useful in the same way that a self-help book or exercises that a therapist provides you with for homework can be helpful. But then they have this disclaimer pop up saying that if you have PTSD, childhood trauma, and so on, it's explicitly not recommended that you try this on your own. You could unearth memories or feelings that you need professional help to help work through safely. You might need support with that. So, and this is going to be a repeated thing for people in crisis, for people with more complex diagnoses, for people at risk. Even these very kind of like professionally made tools might still not be a good idea. So for people with the most sort of dire needs of support, there may not be any substitute for trained team of professionals. This is a promo image for Wobot, which calls itself an enterprise wellness app, or at least it used to. Its website keeps changing. So it was, I think, the first therapy chatbot to get FDA approval for a breakthrough device designation. So this is sort of like a preliminary approval for promising but still experimental medical devices. They recently took the app offline temporarily to work on updates and to try to work on getting certification and approval. So they're trying to get this kind of thing approved by the FDA as a medical device has apparently proven complicated. There are similar apps to this that are still online. WISA, I don't know how you say it, is one that's kind of similar to this. The Wobot's business model seems to be convincing companies and workplaces to add it as a service to their insurance plans, as an addition to traditional therapy or as an alternative to traditional therapy. Is sort of unclear. And so their promotional materials talk about how the productivity of workers goes up by a certain percent when they use the app. So it seems very, very possible that workplaces will add these kinds of tools to their wellness benefit packages and maybe use that as an excuse to reduce coverage for traditional therapy. So there is a danger here of services like this replacing rather than serving as an addition to existing options. And Wobot is mostly script-based. The method that it guides people through is CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. But in addition to the scripts, it has some generative AI aspects sort of built on top of it. And I think basically what that does is like interpreting what the user is saying before sort of running it through its scripts, and then maybe like finessing the text that it's going to respond to at the end. But expanding this generative AI capacity seems to be what they're working on doing while it's offline, so that it can be like more flexible in how it responds and interacts. And one thing that they seem to be focused on right now is making it respond more appropriately to a wider demographic of users. Their website right now seems like very focused on that goal. Yeah, and I'm sure they're well aware that expanding these capacities with generative AI is going to bring with it safety concerns. That's presumably the root of their sort of struggle to get regulatory approval. If you have generative AI functionality, then the tool can do unexpected things. It can do dangerous things that you don't want it to be doing. You can no longer guarantee that the responses it's giving are going to be safe and appropriate ones. But you want the generative AI stuff to make it appealing to people. So you're kind of like stuck in a bind. And then at sort of the other end of the spectrum, the stories that you hear in the news of self-harm following extended use of chatbots, often those are about Replica, which is here. It's the most popular companionship app out there right now. So it's ostensibly companionship apps like Replica are meant to be just for fun. However, it is in fact being used for like therapy adjacent purposes. In Replica, you can choose the appearance of your Replica avatar, give it a name, give it a backstory. You can decide with the click of a button that your relationship has become romantic. You can get virtually married and buy it gifts with real money. And Replica is very much gamified. You get perks and points for engaging of various kinds, and then you're allowed to sort of customize the experience in various ways. And there are lots of things that your Replica might sort of pressure you into spending money on, getting the sort of pro version of the app where you have more capacity, buying it an engagement ring, buying it new outfits, getting it flowers for its fake birthday, stuff like that. But there are also built-in tools and scripts for all kinds of things that certainly look like mental health interventions, CBT exercises, conversational prompts for anxiety, body image, panic attacks, grief, and so on. I took these screenshots about a year ago, and these pages have disappeared. So these are no longer like explicitly offered as options, but you can like still start a conversation with your Replica saying like, I'm feeling grief, can you help me about it? And it will go into therapist mode and start sort of talking from its grief script. So this app and others like it are in fact doing some kind of mental health adjacent intervention, but without having sought anything like regulatory approval for doing that, without having done any safety or effectiveness testing. So this is concerning. And then they make these confusing and contradictory claims about whether or not they're providing mental health care. So there are promotional materials, they advertise things like it can combat loneliness and depression. But then even like within its medical disclaimer, they say that there's evidence that it can assist in recovery. And in the same sentence, they claim that they're not making any claims to providing therapeutic benefit. But earlier in the sentence, they did. Yeah. And then at the bottom, like IFS Buddy, like Wobot, like all of the options available, they do not provide crisis intervention services. So the fine print tells you to call 911 if you're in crisis. The bot itself might not tell you to do that. So they're kind of like covering their asses with this bit of fine print, while actually providing something that certainly looks like some kind of mental health intervention. And there are a lot of other apps out there. This has sort of given you kind of like the range from the boring but professional to the exciting but horrifying, in my opinion. I spent $99 of research funds on a replica AI girlfriend, and it was so boring. I did not get my money's worth. Okay. There are professional rules in place for human providers of mental health care. They're expected to do things like avoid conflicts of interest, manage confidential data securely, follow safety precautions. None of this is required by wellness apps. Wobot has chosen to be HIPAA compliant. That's the Health Information Privacy Law in the US. But they don't have to be HIPAA compliant because they're not actually dealing with health information. Health information has to come from like a doctor or hospital to count as health information under privacy law. So even if you're telling a bot about your diagnosis, that isn't officially health information. So there's sort of a regulatory gap here for all of these apps. And since stigma is one of the main reasons why marginalized communities like non-human care, data security ought to be a priority. Wobot, as mentioned, does have is HIPAA compliant. That sort of covers it. Replica certainly is not HIPAA compliant. Lots of the other options are not. ChatGPT is definitely not. Replica is doing something more like surveillance capitalism, like offering what seems like a free service so they can gather information about people, and who knows what they're doing with it. Selling lists of people with particular diagnoses to Robert F. Kennedy, like maybe possibility. So yeah, there's some concerns. And none of the tools that I've seen offer care for high-risk patients. That's something that's not offered. And I gave Wobot a question mark for conflicts of interest because the studies that they cite for effectiveness and safety of their tools were done by them. Like the CEO of Wobot is the first author on those studies. Whether culturally appropriate care for all is available is a question mark for all of these. Whether they're effective and safe is also sort of a question mark for all of these. So I'm going to look into those last two a little bit more and see what kind of evidence exists so far. So there's not really any evidence that I could find about culturally appropriate care for diverse groups via chatbot therapy. But as I indicated earlier, there are some reasons for potential concern. So representational harms, like stereotyping, that's something that's sort of well covered in the algorithmic bias literature. I haven't seen it applied in any systematic way to this particular case. But there are other kinds of potential harms. So privacy violations affect some groups more than others. So if you're talking to a chatbot about being autistic or being trans, that's more sensitive information than if you're talking to the chatbot about how you had a fight with your mother. So some groups, privacy violations are more of an issue than others. And if the care that you're receiving doesn't take into account your cultural values, you might not be able to act on the advice that you're given. So quality of service would be reduced in those cases. And can we expect chatbots to adapt therapies for different cultures? Well, they're pretty good at translating, at least for languages that are well represented on the internet. So translating something like a therapy script into another language, maybe it could do that reasonably well, but cultural adaptation has to go deeper than that. So just as an example, for a culture that has a taboo about talking about the body, something like somatic therapy where you touch your chest and then like focus on what you're holding there, that's something that maybe wouldn't work in that culture, and you would need to adapt some different kind of somatic therapy that wouldn't involve things that are sort of taboo in that culture. And that's just one example. So it's not just a matter of translating the words. The whole structure of the intervention might need adjustment in various ways, depending on the values of the culture, whether they value like authority or whether they value like family over individuality. Like all of these things might make something, that looks codependent in one culture be just sort of like being a good child to your parents in another culture. And that all would need to be encoded explicitly at some point by some kind of a professional. If that hasn't been done yet, if no therapist has done that work of adapting a method to a given community, then there is no training corpus out there that a large language model could learn from in order to be able to do this well. So that access gap can't be closed just by translation, just by predicting next words. In terms of effectiveness, there are a bunch of studies out there. The platforms providing some of these services advertise their own results of their own studies of safety and effectiveness, which tend to be more glowing than the independent ones. There are also a bunch of very sort of small sample size studies that show various things. I've tried to pick out some of the bigger and more independent ones here, but this is sort of like a very brief summary of some of the results out there. So a study of WISA found that a well-established self-assessment measure of therapeutic alliance that asks questions like, I believe that the therapist likes me, we agree on what it's important to work on, things like that. These are sort of measures of the alliance between the therapist and the client. That measure increased slightly from 3 days to 5 days of use. So it looks like it's increasing over a very short time period. And then a bond score that was based on textual analysis of their conversations, looking for things like, does the participant say, thank you, that was helpful, or like, that wasn't helpful, that kind of thing. That measure was within the range of more traditional methods of CBT therapy. All of this was done within the app, though, so like in some way in partnership with the company, although nothing is disclosed in the paper in terms of conflicts of interest, as far as I could tell. So unclear. And then the second one is a more independent, larger meta-analysis of a bunch of conversational AI tools. And they came to the conclusion that while there are short-term effects for a variety of symptoms, anxiety, depression, and so on, the long-term effects are insignificant from the studies that they reviewed. And then a very recent study that's by some researchers at MIT and some researchers at OpenAI, which makes ChatGPT, they found that higher use of ChatGPT correlates with loneliness, dependence on the app, and other kind of problematic uses. So that's, again, not good news. So the kind of gloss I put on this is that it's not really clear that generative AI is bringing much of value aside from this sort of wave of popularity and greater engagement. But in terms of actually giving therapeutic benefit, it's not doing a better job than the script-based methods, and it's adding a bunch of other stuff on top that is not really wanted. And whether we want to achieve engagement through sort of gamification and kind of like manipulation tactics, when that kind of use can increase loneliness and dependence and has these sort of risks associated with it, is a question that we should grapple with. Is it worth it to get more engagement? Maybe if sort of safety is still in place. So what about safety? And there's a bunch of anecdotal evidence out there about things like a child help phone line replacing all of its volunteers with a chatbot and then having to reverse that decision after a single day because it's doing things like missing really obvious signs of abuse, giving people calling about eating disorders, dieting tips, and things like that that they don't want to do. Most of the tools out there, according to the systematic review, don't even collect safety data. When they do analyze safety, they use a wide variety of methods to do so. They don't do any statistical analysis, so it's like not a very good safety analysis, and there's no sort of like agreement about how we should be doing that. And the main safety mechanism is just excluding the most at-risk users. That's kind of across the board how safety is in fact done. A scoping review that was done here at U of T concluded that these tools need better data security and privacy. Also pointed out this lack of standardization of the evaluation metrics, and found that not even half the tools reviewed effectively addressed suicidal thoughts. And Replica, ChatGPT, Wopot, and Visa were all part of this study among the tools that they were looking at. And then the last one is a paper that's more about the regulatory situation. And it's pointing out that apps like Replica managed to avoid regulators entirely by marketing themselves as wellness apps rather than health apps. But as I mentioned, even health apps don't fall under health privacy law. So we need to figure out how to both measure effectiveness and safety of these tools and how to regulate them, how to get rid of this sort of regulatory gray area that they fit into. So there are nevertheless some uses that seem fairly safe to automate. These are the more formulaic tasks that can be done with scripts, diagnostic testing, referrals to care, formulaic interventions like CBT and IFS for low-risk patients only, maybe matching people to therapy modalities or overcoming resistance to therapy, doing sort of like a trial run of a method and seeing if you like it. That kind of thing might be useful, but for longer-term care, it's sort of unclear that these are up to the task. And so I'm gonna end with a note of caution. Like, although we need all the help that we can get in the mental health space, so it's tempting to agree with arguments saying like we should use whatever tools are available to sort of stem the flow of crisis. We have too few providers. Like, why not use these tools if they're available and if they're useful for some people? But if the most vulnerable people are getting the worst care as a result of these tools, then that doesn't really solve the crisis. It just kind of like shifts it to the side. Thanks.
Any questions?
So many.
I know. I don't want to be selfish, so. Go ahead, sir.
So,